Over the last couple of days, more and more footage has been emerging from Kazakhstan, showing protests from an increasingly unhappy country, with thousands taking to the streets to protest the government. The problem is, it's hard to actually tell what's going on. So in this video, we're going to be trying to examine the protests in Kazakhstan, protests which have already forced the resignation of the Kazakh government. If you want more from TLDR, be sure to subscribe to the channel and follow us on Twitter for stories which never make it to YouTube, including various updates on this issue. It's linked down below. Now, before we get into the story, a quick qualification. Reporting from Kazakhstan is somewhat unreliable. The Kazakh government has a long history of censorship, with Kazakhstan ranking a dismal 155th in the RSF's Press Freedom Index, and, as we'll be getting onto in a second, have apparently restricted internet access in the country. We'll source all our claims here and amend any claims accordingly, but just be aware that this video is subject to change. Anyway, with that said, let's get into it. The way we're going to structure this video is to start by explaining the proximate cause of the protests, a rise in gas prices in Western Kazakhstan, before explaining how and why the protests spiralled into nationwide anti-government protests. So, the proximate cause, a rise in gas prices in Western Kazakhstan. The story really begins on January the 1st, when residents of Zhanaozen, a city in the western province of Mangao-Sto, woke up to find the price of liquefied petroleum gas had jumped up by 50% overnight. Liquefied petroleum gas, or LPG, is a propane-butane mixture that acts as a cheap alternative to petrol or diesel, used by some 90% of Zhanaozen residents in their vehicles. High LPG prices are bad news for Mangao-Sto residents, not just because most of the province relies on LPG for vehicle fuel, but also because Mangao-Sto is a desert, which means they import most of its produce. So, high LPG costs translates into higher prices across the board. Anyway, for much of 2021, 1 litre of LPG in Zhanaozen was about 50 tenge, or 12 cents. Towards the end of the year, with gas prices rising across the world, it steadily rose to about 80 tenge, or about 18 cents, and this was the price on December the 31st. Then, overnight, prices jumped 50% to 120 tenge on January the 1st. Now, no one's quite sure why this happened, and Kazakh officials came up with 3 separate explanations. Local Mangao-Sto officials blamed high demand in winter. Kazakh Energy Minister Magzum Mirzagalev accused gas stations of price fixing. And the Kazakh Energy Minister pointed to the recent shift to electronic LPG trading, which basically means that LPG prices are now calibrated with international markets. And, as you might have noticed, gas prices are pretty high at the moment. Anyway, on January the 1st, a few hundred motorists in Zhanaozen started protesting. Protests, by the way, are essentially illegal in Kazakhstan. They're only allowed if organisers file a notice with the government in advance. By January the 2nd, protests had spread to much of Mangao-Sto, and on January the 3rd, local authorities then agreed to bring the price of gas back down to about 85 tenge, but insisted the previous price of 50 tenge was not viable. By then, though, it was too late. The protests had spread across Kazakhstan and morphed into wider anti-government protests. On January the 4th, thousands of protesters in Almaty, the country's largest city, were attacked by police with rubber bullets, tear gas and stun grenades as protests continued well into the night. Protesters apparently broke into the mayor's office, and there were reports of a fire in the building. More than 200 protesters were detained and 95 police officers were injured, according to the Kazakh Interior Ministry. Recognising the scale of the crisis, at 8 p.m. that night, the government introduced price controls to bring the price of LPG in Mangao-Sto back down to 50 tenge per litre, and reportedly blocked internet access in the country, with Telegram, WhatsApp and Messenger unavailable in the evening. Early the next morning, the government resigned and the president announced a 2-week state of emergency in Mangao-Sto and Almaty. So, will these measures stem the protests? Well, let's start with the price controls. There are 2 problems here. A, it's not clear they'll actually work, and B, the protests are no longer just about the gas. Let's start with whether they'll actually work. Despite being an oil-rich country, Kazakhstan has an estimated oil reserve of 30 billion barrels, and Kashagan oil field is the largest outside the Middle East. But Kazakhstan suffers from regular gas shortages. This is essentially for two reasons. First, the government has failed to invest in Kazakh gas infrastructure, which means that extraction is both unreliable and inefficient, and second, it makes more financial sense for producers to export gas to Kazakhstan's neighbours, where gas prices are significantly higher. A litre of LPG in Russia, for example, currently costs about 41 cents, which comes to about 180 tenge. A litre of LPG in Kyrgyzstan is 47 cents, or roughly 200 tenge. It's possible that price controls will encourage producers to export their gas, leading to shortages. But even if the price controls did work, at this point the protests are no longer about the price of LPG in Western Kazakhstan. This is why the protests continued on Wednesday after the announcement of price controls. While that might have been their proximate cause, the protests have now spiralled into wider anti-government protests. To understand this, you probably need to know a little bit about Kazakhstan's political history. From its independence from the Soviet Union in April 1990 until March 2019, Kazakhstan was run by Nursultan Nazarbayev, who was both president and, from 2010, so-called leader of the nation. We're not going to go into too many details, but, as you might have guessed, Kazakhstan wasn't particularly democratic under his tenure. In March 2019, after anti-government protests in the capital Astana, which, by the way, was renamed Nur-Sultan in his honour a week or so later, Nazarbayev resigned as president, but retained his title as leader of the nation, which protects him from prosecution, and became chairman of the Security Council and chairman of the ruling party, Nur-Otan, giving him significant influence over policy and vetoes over most senior government positions. A snap election was held for the presidency, which was won by Nazarbayev ally Kassym-Jomart Tokayev. The election was marred by reports of vote stuffing, internet blockages, and voter pressuring, while mainstream opposition parties, including Mukhtar Oblyzatov, Democratic Choice of Kazakhstan, were declared extremist organisations and banned from competing. Somewhat unsurprisingly, Tokayev won by a landslide, with 71% of the vote. Anyway, you get the point. Kazakhstan is probably best described as an autocracy, which means that if the Kazakh people are unhappy with the government, they have to express this via protest. And, well, the Kazakh government hasn't been doing a great job recently. Inflation, which has been running pretty hot over the last few years, hit a 5-year high of 8.9%, according to the most recent data, forcing interest rates up to 9.75%. To keep up with inflation, many Kazakhs have been forced to take out loans. According to credit bureau First Credit, 7.1 million out of 9 million economically active Kazakhs have some sort of loan, worth an average of 1 million tenge per person. The Kazakh government is also pretty corrupt. It came 94th out of 180 countries in Transparency 2021's Corruption Perception Index, and ineffective at implementing policies, thanks mostly to an over-centralised post-Soviet administrative structure. Anyway, you get the point. Kazakhstan has its problems, most notably out-of-control inflation, and this is presumably what the protesters are complaining about, although it's hard to know precisely given that the protests aren't being organised by a single group. Whether the protests continue will probably depend on the strength of the response by the Kazakh security forces. So, as always, subscribe to stay updated, and follow us on Twitter for more updates on this issue and others. A special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. If you want to see your name at the end of videos, then sign up by clicking the link below.